all for joining us today. I'm very excited about this. So I love interviewing authors. So I love to have these talks. They're very exciting for librarians to be involved in and to engage with those that write the books that we love to read. So
thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's author talk with Chidiogo Akunyili-Parr. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The land we are standing on today is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Oshawa is covered under the Williams Treaties, and as settler on these lands, we are all treaty people. May we respectfully honor and acknowledge the understanding of Indigenous stewards of these ancestral lands and ensure that the voices of the First Peoples are represented in our collections, programs, and services. We are pleased today to welcome Chidiogo Akunyili-Parr, who will be discussing her book, I Am Because We Are, An African Mother's Fight for the Soul of a Nation. In this innovative and intimate memoir, a daughter tells the story of her mother, a Pan-African hero who faced down misogyny and battled corruption in Nigeria. Inspired by the African philosophy of Ubuntu, the importance of community over the individual, and outraged by injustice, Dora Akunyili took on fraudulent drug manufacturers whose products killed millions, including her sister at the age of 21. A woman in a man's world, she was elected and became a cabinet minister, but she had to deal with political maneuverings, death threats, and even an assassination attempt for defending the voiceless. She suffered for it, as did her marriage and her 6 children. I Am Because We Are illuminates the role of kinship, family, and the individual's place in society while revealing a life of courage, how community shaped it, and the web of humanity that binds us all. Chidiogo Akunyili-Parr is a Nigerian Canadian author, speaker, and consultant with a passion for human development and connection. She is the founder of She Roars, an organization committed to coaching women of color around the world to connect to their intuition and purpose. Her work is focused on harnessing the power of our interdependence with a foundation in the humanist African philosophy of Ubuntu, which celebrates our shared humanity. Chidiogo has lived and worked across 4 continents and speaks 7 languages, including Mandarin, German, Spanish, and French, allowing for an even deeper connection with people. She led the growth and impact of the global shapers community across Africa and the Middle East. So this afternoon, we'll be having some question and answer. I'll be interviewing and giving some questions about the topic of the book that we're discussing today, as well as what brought Chidiogo to writing this book about her mother. So first off, the title of the book, I Am Because We Are, is a theme that seems to run through a lot of your talks and writings. And was this always the title you had in mind for your book? You're muted, actually.
Classic Zoom. 2 years in. Hello, everybody. I'm so happy that we could share in the space. Thank you so much, Nicole. To your question, no, not at all. I played with many titles, but I remember always knowing that when the true title came to me, I would know. I always said that and thought that. And, at some point it was The Flight of the Monarch. And I had this whole analogy of the journey of the monarch butterflies is in thinking of ancestry and a connection to the people that have come before us through the analogy of, so I went through a lot of different titles. And at some point it was The Beautiful Ones Have Been Born. If you're familiar with the Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, etc., etc. So when I Am Because We Are fully came in, and to your point, Ubuntu is a philosophy that I've been not only familiar with, but sharing and working on and speaking on and working on people founded on that philosophy. So when it fully anchored that that was what was coming to me, and that was what the book was desiring to be called, if you could put it that way, it was so clear, and I was really grateful that that came through, and that she is. I think you're mute now.
I was. Now we're taking turns. I had listened to a talk that you'd given, a student talk when you graduated from Johns Hopkins University. And you had mentioned even then, back in 2012, of the I am because we are, and you'd sort of expounded upon that, I think, more in the book as well. It's sort of, when I saw that, I thought, oh, she knew back then this is what she's going to write about. But obviously it was like came full circle, because I heard her, I heard you talk about it 10 years ago. And like, oh, really? She knew then. But I figured it was sort of something that came full circle for you. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
So the book I mentioned is kind of innovative. For those that haven't yet had the chance to read it, it's written from your mother's point of view, sort of like an autobiography, but written by her daughter. How did you decide on writing it in her voice? And what were some of the challenges that you faced when you were doing this?
So when the invitation, my mother is late, and I got the invitation to write her story after her passing. And it was as I reflect in the book, it was almost like her voice came to me, but in many ways it was just my voice connecting to a calling. And when this came to me, there was also the invitation to write in her voice. And I remember hearing this, sort of feeling this and going, yeah, but that's impossible, because I do not sound anything like my mother. Different generations, different people. She's, so it's like I could never imitate my mother's voice in writing, in speaking, in flow. So I sort of moved away from that very quickly, and I actually wrote the skeleton, so to say, of the entire book, third person. And when I finished it, something wasn't right. And I thought, something is off. And I was reflecting with a friend of mine who is also a writer. And he's like, there's such a distance between you and Dora. I feel like you're always coming in. And then he said something that really stayed with me. It's like, you're not even born and you're so present, telling about your mother's story. And I thought, that's true. So what ended up being really beautiful was that I could honor the story without trying to sound like, because it was already sort of outlined, and go back and sort of rethink to just speak in her voice, first person. And only then did the book feel like, this is the skeleton. And then I could really start writing. So that was the journey. And it's been so interesting how the feedback I've received has been again and again, how people feel connected to her. Like she is the one sharing that story. And, in the book, I do come in as my voice. And I'm really happy that the distinction can be felt, even though there was not an exaggerated attempt at being different. It nevertheless is.
It was really interesting, because I listened to it in an audio format, and so it was sort of told in a voice that I felt was your mother speaking, because it was all, I did this and I did this, I went here and I went to school here, I lived in this village. And I'm thinking, well, how did you know all of you? How did you discover all the details that happened to your mother well before you were born? And her imagining maybe her feelings about something. Does she have writings that you pulled from, or you spoke to friends, relatives to pull those stories together into sort of a cohesive narrative from her?
Both, absolutely. Both. She does have a book, but that was focused on the later part of her life. But in that book, it's called My War Against Fake Drugs. And it really goes deep into the work she did at the helm of the Food and Drug Regulatory Agency, NAFDAC. And in the sort of forward of that book, she does explore her life in the village, her formative years, but it's 2 pages. So beyond that, I interviewed tens of people. Secondary school teachers, we say secondary school in Nigeria, high school teachers, siblings, best friends, my siblings, her coworkers, her, just sort of really diverse group of people that knew her from a young age into adulthood. And it was fascinating as well to see how they all had different, how we have pieces of a person, someone would have a piece of hers, how she was athletic. And it was like, athletic? I did not know that part about my mother. So it was also a journey of getting to know my mother by interviewing these people and finding so much about her that I didn't know, and weaving it, so to say, into this story that you're reading and you read.
Now, you mentioned that you're one of a number of children, 6 children. And I think you said you're the 5th of 6 children. And what do you think made this book necessary for you, particularly to write? And were your siblings obviously were involved in the process because you had older siblings, but were they encouraging you to write the book? Were they sort of, what spoke to you? You were already a writer, so it made sense, or?
So we're 6 of us, and my parents had a dream that would all be doctors. So interestingly enough, I'm not a doctor, where the first 3 are, the last 3 are not. So that tells you something. So I think my parents never really knew what I was, because there was like doctors and there's artists, and they would look at me when they were introduced to me and just go, diplomat. I was not a diplomat. It just needed, a title to capture what I was doing. Why I share this was, interestingly enough, my father has been putting something in the newspaper in Nigeria every year since my mom had passed, just remembering her, and he'll talk about what we're doing. And my name, last time he wrote repertoire. And I was quite upset because I was like, what is a repertoire? That's not what I do. And my father has since passed, and I've just been reflecting on how, if you had to really, what does that word mean? In some ways, I'm the storyteller and the record keeper in the family. Mm-hmm. And I was the one that had the space by doing everything and, whatever it is that I do that no one really knows, that I could actually say yes to a project like this. But beyond that, I love writing. I journal for over a decade. Every day, it's a practice of mine, and it was beautiful to be able to write a story that felt so personal, because in many ways, that's my writing style. It's always sort of, as you can imagine, journaling could be. So it felt like it was always meant to be that I would be the one to write this, in some ways that my father had spoken that already. And I felt called to it, and I enjoyed getting to know my mother and connecting to a story and sharing in a way that all felt so natural.
Now, I noticed at the start of every chapter of the book, you begin it with a proverb. And I found those so fascinating. I was copying them and saving them into a little list of just wonderful proverbs that sort of start each chapter. Was that a natural progression? Did you already think you were going to do that? Or was that sort of a later stage? You wrote the chapters and then added the proverbs in to sort of reflect what was being written about?
So first of all, why Proverbs? I'm Igbo from the southeast of Nigeria. And if you remember, Chinua Achebe talked about how Proverbs is the palm oil with which words are eaten. So we're big on Proverbs. And my father was such an orator. And his thing, you see him in the village, step up, and he always was the person called up to speak, to break kola nuts, to bless an occasion. And he would always use Proverbs and had a book full of Proverbs. So all my life, I'd just been fascinated, not just by hearing, just how perfect it can be in an occasion when someone can just pull out the right proverb in any moment. It's a blessing. And I have a love for Proverbs. So when I was writing the book, I wanted to honor that love somewhere. And, you see beyond the opening chapters, there are Proverbs here and there, but it really sort of like halfway through coming across more and more, also some of my father's. I realized that there was not enough space to include as many as I wanted. So it was like a natural progression to just honor the richness And actually, these are not just Igbo proverbs. I stepped back and I wanted to honor the bigger tradition of the continent, from where the title of the book comes from, Ubuntu. So they're African proverbs, and there's also one that's actually diaspora. So that being said, I'm happy that it resonated and that you like them.
I did so much. It was I think an interesting view into, I had a feeling that there was a history of storytelling in your family in that way. And that sort of, you honored that. I just love that aspect of it. In the process of writing this story, it must have felt like discovering many sides to your mother that you didn't know about. Is there anything that surprised you or that you learned along the process that made you sit back and appreciate so much what she'd done that you didn't know about?
One of the things, so I was 3 years old when my mother went away to the UK for her PhD. We mentioned earlier that I'm number 5 of 6. So she left 5 children behind and went away. And I've always taken it for granted. Somehow a story. It's just I was 3, and when you're growing up, you just know she did her PhD at some point. But I think there are nuances of her story like that you start doing the calculation, you start realizing, and as a new mother myself, somehow the sacrifice that she made to leave 5 children. And, with that, I was interviewing my brother, and he was just sharing how there was just so much pushback. The judgment, how can you leave 5 children? As you can imagine, that's a lot. Who is going to take it? What if something, God forbid, happens? You will be blamed all the way in the UK. It would be. So this is to say there are parts of her story that are taken for granted. And there's something about stepping back and really understanding the pagosum, so to say, you start just on unpacking it, you maybe start and being with the emotions of the time as opposed to just, the story that she was gone. I think that was what struck me, actually going beyond her story to connecting with how she must have felt at every moment. The moments when she was struggling so hard to make ends meet and with 6 children. And at the same time, having such a deep desire for us to have a better life. Understanding now that drive that she had, always pushing herself that we might have a better life. And again, there's also the lens of as a mom now, which I incidentally start the book saying how a friend said that you can write a better story of your mother when you're a mother yourself. And I go into how that was sort of a half truth. And now I'm seeing how it's an even deeper truth, because there's things that I even now I'm still reflecting, I'm still unpacking. But as a big surprise on, I didn't know that. Nothing is coming to me now. But I think it's just sort of not just being her child and feeling into her as a woman and how she felt at every stage of these experiences, that for me was just my mother's story and, parked away somewhere.
You speak of being a new mother, and I had seen your Instagram post where you had you talked about getting something in the mail. You got your new book in the mail and you pulled it out and showed it. And then you said, and something else arrived, and you leaned over and you grabbed the baby and you brought her up as well. And said that they, you can pre-order my book and my baby sends her blessings. And I thought that was just a perfect, because it's an honoring your mother and you're a new mother yourself. It was a perfect juxtaposition of those two things. It was just really heartwarming to see. So I thought that was an interesting promotional, like, I have a book and, oh, look, I also got a baby. And you called them both your babies because you spent so much time. Like, how long did it take you to write the book when you first decided to write it to when it was published?
3 years writing, a whole year of interviewing. So it's about, I'll say 4 years total. But when I say writing, the first words was about 3 years, give or take. Yes.
And it evolved over time. Like you didn't have a set you said you had the skeleton, I think of it, you've spoken about before, the
Mm.
skeleton of the story and sort of fleshing it out. Did you, you said that uh, the recurring story in your family, as you just mentioned, with your mother being away, all of your family sort of being spread um, across the world in various places. And this is something when you, even when you're writing in your mother's voice, talking about, oh, my daughter is here and my son is here. And it was just that constant, just, it didn't seem to be a strange thing. It's sort of like just constantly being away from each other and coming back together when it was necessary. And you've said that that's an ongoing theme in your family of not really spending enough time together. And do you see this book as sort of a way for you to help reconnect with both your mother and her life and also your family? You're bringing them together in this, for this book.
Absolutely. And, with that question, I'm also connecting to a truth of the earlier question you asked me around what stood out. And I would like to add to that something that I never really spent time with was the story of my grandparents and my great-grandmother. And it was realizing that my great-grandmother was part of, the Igbos used to, there was a belief in that twins were not good news. So we used to, they used to be killed. And she had her twins killed. To find that out at the month, that just as part of researching the story was huge. And also to find out that my mother was also partly part of a female genital, I think mutilation is really the word that is used now, was also a discovery and that I didn't know about. It was something that my sister knew and she shared with me. So, and this sort of now speaks to your other question around what happens when families are spread. Is that some of these stories that you might assume you would know for sure is that there might not have really been the space for them to surface, And I think, and I know that this has been a really beautiful, my first cousin, my mom's sister's daughter reached out and she was so happy to have the book because she was seeing her story and able to share it with her kids because it's our shared story and everyone is all over the world and these stories are scattered and sometimes will never have been told. So I think there is a blessing there, but it's not just about my family. I think one of the things that I explore is this is a bigger story. Her story is not unique. And in many ways, that's what I hope the book surfaces is that story, her story isn't unique. And in many ways, the invitation as such is to know that we have that in us, that, that resilience, the drive, the values, all of that is part of us because we share these stories. So I feel like I was sharing a bigger story because it's not just my family scattered as a country. Go anywhere, you see Nigerians, right? We're everywhere if you want to speak to Nigerians or Africans. Or so I think there is a theme there of where being in different parts of the world, but this connects us to home. And for my immediate family, for bigger family, as a tribal family, for bigger national family, so it goes. And then a human family, connecting back to that Ubuntu. This is a universal story that I trust we all have pieces of us within it. But for my family, most certainly, it's been a beautiful remembering.
So it serves as both the history of your mother and the family, but also a larger community, which I think ties a lot of people into it. It brings so many aspects to the story of Nigeria that most people haven't either heard in this way and told from such a personal point of view, as well as from someone who was so much. I think I read a quote that your mother gave about there's nothing that that I've done for my country that it hasn't also done for me, because she was just so much in love with Nigeria and standing up for it, especially with I found it so heartbreaking with the drug manufacturing, the fake drugs that were out there for so many years, and she coming into as a pharmacist and being I think it was head of the Food and Drug Organization, you said, regulating body, NAVDAC, and her coming in and being very forceful and wanting to change things, and coming up against so much resistance to that, of the corruption that had existed for generations, that this is just the way it is done. Where do you think she got that strength and her sense of purpose to know that she could just not give in and push till she saw change?
Many layers to that answer. For one, first off, she lost her sister. Her sister died following complications from fake insulin. And her sister was like a daughter to her. And I reflect on that relationship. So this hurt her deeply, especially because she had already seen so much loss in her life. And another is also having gone through the war and just seen death and what that does to community, to a people, the loss of human life. So put that, and her going through so much of that herself, and then the values that were instilled in her growing up in the village of respecting human life, of the value of the contribution. So it's a mix of all of that, and then perhaps finally her own role, her father bringing her up to know that she had a role and to honor that she carried within herself. Her light, so to say. So I think a mix of that meant that when she did have the opportunity to make a change, and especially in an agency where it was 80% of foods and drugs in the country at that time were fake or expired or substandard. And if you think about it, that's huge. Think you go to Shoppers and you want to get your baby formula, you don't think twice. You don't even think to look at the expiration date, because that's clear to you that someone is doing that. Imagine when, on the contrary, someone is working to shield that it's expired, and it's just the opposite, or that it's not baby formula, it's flour, and you serve this to your infant, and or antibiotics that's meant after open heart surgery, or insulin, or whatever it is you put in your body, food or drugs, even lotions, bleaching creams that were they're already toxic, but imagine when bleaching cream is toxic, then it's even worse. And so it went. So she came into a country where people were dying unnecessarily, in the situation in the country, and that she felt it on a personal level, and she gave her all, her energy, her love, her fire to curbing that. And she's someone who knew she couldn't do it alone, so she really worked hard to not just get the rest of NAFDAC staff on board, but the whole country came along with her. And that's how she became Dora Akunyili, because literally overnight, people didn't even know about this agency, suddenly were empowered to support the eradication of fake drugs. And so it goes, and so it goes. So she leaned into her beliefs, her values, her pain, and she worked and she battled for the people from that space.
I know, coming off of her being leader, the general, Director General of NAFDAC. And then she was hoping to become the Minister of Health under a new government. I think they were deciding who was getting which positions. And you write about her being very disappointed she was given the Minister of Information role. And you write that she didn't know what to do with that. She seemed disappointed, but also took on a new challenge and found a way to make a lot of other successes from this role as well, namely Rebranding Nigeria, the Rebranding Nigeria project, and coming up with a new slogan for the country, and kind of giving people back the everyday Nigerian back the pride of their country. And I think initially when she took on the role of Minister of Information, she was sort of parroting what the government was telling her to say, but they weren't giving her much information. And one example was when the leader at the time was away having surgery, and she was not told where he was, and she had to lie to say that he was healthy. And finally, she gave up and said, "They're not giving me any information." She started to be really honest, saying, "I have no information as Minister of Information." And that sort of, to me, was just her saying, we need to fix this, and finally standing up for herself in that new role. So I just wondered, from that perspective, it just seems that she took on whatever was given to her and said, well, let's just make lemonade out of lemons here. I don't really want this role, but I'm going to make it the best I can do. And it seems that she did that throughout her life, take on a new challenge, even up to when she was quite ill.
And in many ways, this is why I'm called to share her story. And this is why many celebrate that her story is being told, because it is a beautiful trait to make the best of the worst, not just make the best by words alone, but truly just always honor that you will do your best and you'd have hope and show up in all whatever way you want to capture that. And she went through difficulties as a child, but she never gave into despair, and always sort of just made the best of the situation, and always not just by pushing herself. I'm losing the word that I want to use here, but really giving her all in whatever's the situation. So when she had this huge platform, NAFDAC, she gave everything, and very quickly people saw the results, because she's someone that when she gives her all, it could move mountains. That was her personality. She would walk in a room and you'd feel her presence. She was that kind of person. And so when she, do you know the word I'm looking for? When you implement yourself? Anyhow, doesn't matter.
Reinvent yourself?
No, like putting herself in the situation fully. In any case, I think I'm being understood.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so when she went into the ministry, there was a disappointment, because she had hoped and thought, everyone as well, that she would become Minister of Health, because there was a natural progression, and health in Nigeria needs support, as in so many ways, in human lives, and NAFDAC was one, and health was the next step. So when she got information, as in her heart, it's like, how do you help people through a ministry that is about communication? So I think that was her first sort of, the despair, the lemon. But then within that, she thought, you know what? How do we create a different story? And here, you think of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's single story, and Nigeria most certainly is a victim, so to say, of a single story, right? Because if you bring up Nigeria, many might, scam artists and corruption and maybe little in between, but there's so much to the country. There's so much to the people. One of the most incredible people you ever meet are Nigerians. And there's a warmth, there's a depth, there's a joy, there's a creativity, there's so much. And she felt like the world could not meet that, and we were all stuck in that single story of Nigeria. So her rebrand was an attempt to allow the country, the people, to not just tell a different story, but for us to enjoy a different story of us, and not all be bucketed 200 million of us into one story of a couple thousand people. So that being said, the rebranding was born, but in many ways, it's hard to say it was a success, even though everyone overnight, because that's her ability, knew of good people, great nation. That was the slogan. But for it to really take root, for us to really believe that we're good people, great nation, that was a little harder, because we've been through so many decades of just seeing the worst of leadership, and the worst of us in some ways have come to our attention via the media, etc. And so people rejected that, almost going, the government needs to fix itself before we band-aid it. So that was something that, she tried really hard to remind us of who we were in a way that I feel like, interestingly enough, I think Nigerians are now ready and coming into that ourselves. So it's actually planted the seeds, like, remember, we are this. And say, oh, maybe not so, we're not sure because things are not going well. And now it's like, like, look at what Nigerians are doing in the world right now. And then you mentioned, I think, did you mention the other campaign? No, you didn't. So she made the best of things, but it was always sort of because she gave her all, and she always trusted that wherever she was where she was meant to be, even though it didn't feel perfect, and she would commit herself fully.
You'd mentioned that your father had passed away, but I think you'd said also that he was aware you were writing the book and it was fully in support of you writing the book. Did it somehow draw you closer to him after her passing, to sort of write about her? I know he didn't see you finish the book, but he knew that it was happening.
So when I went to him with the idea, very quick, but when I had the idea, I went to all my siblings, my father, for their blessing, because this is our story, their story, very personal. There was some like, are you sure you want to do this? Because are you going to tell everything, because all families have their,
Yeah.
So my father was a little, but when I went to him, he was in full support. I think in Nigeria, when we write stories like this, it tends to be pretty cut dry. Like, Dora was born here and she did this and she did that. So I'm pretty sure that's what he expected. So we did interviews. He introduced me to great people that I interviewed, and he was not only full support, but went out of his way to make sure that it happened, because I think he just thought it would be a good, nice story. So a few months before it was published, I was very clear that I didn't want him to be, off guard by whatever is in there. So it was from the beginning, when everybody's like, are you sure? Are you sure? It's like, one thing you would know is that Daddy will read the book before it comes out, and it's important. So I sent him to almost final manuscript, and he loved it. And to your question, I think that did a lot, because I don't think I've ever really had space to tell him what I am, what I think, how I think. Um, you know, I think the closest my father might have come to really listening to me might have been that graduation speech you mentioned. So in many ways, it was almost like he didn't really know me anymore. And I felt like this was an introduction, in as much as my mother. I trust that you get a sense of how I think and how my heart flows when you read it. And I was surprised by the parts that were not so beautiful, if so, just honest about the things that were not perfect or rosy. And he sent back a DHL with all his notes, and he would just skip some parts that I was so sure that I had to like call him and have a big conversation and like resent that he wants me to take it out, and nothing. So he honored my telling, and that meant the world to me, because we were all so convinced that he wouldn't. There was sort of this like, have you told Daddy? Has Daddy read it? And then I'm like, Daddy read it. He liked it. Like, really? I'm like, yeah, he has like good notes, and on it went. So I think it was a gift that he gave of sort of like, I get it. It's okay. And it's not just okay. I celebrate it. And we were able to then move into a different layer of communication after he read it. I felt that shift in a way that was subtle but there, and we would have longer conversations sort of beyond the Chichi, how are you? I'm fine. Are you safe? Everything, like it became a little more, what's going on? How are things? And sort of pushing the stretches of the conversation to go a little deeper in a way that just our upbringing hadn't allowed for. And I appreciated that. I appreciate that I have a stack of the book with his handwriting, smells of him, which I hadn't fully realized he had such a smell until you get a pack of paper that someone has read through and smells of them. So that means more to me now than I thought then in receiving it.
It's so lovely that that was you got his personal stamp of approval on it.
Mhm.
I know because he's, they're like you say, every family has its things hidden, and not talked about. And you said your family was so spread out that they might not have known about these aspects of even the further generations back. But the more recent, of course, and he doesn't always come out looking great in some of these sections, as you were mentioning. Is he gonna? I know which sections you're referring to, where he wasn't, um, you know, uh, challenges that people have in their marriages, and with your mother being very driven, and him being supportive, because he was a doctor, right? So he was also a very busy man and very, very accomplished. I think you mentioned, I think it might go back to the talk that you gave when on your graduation speech, that as successful as people in your family are, it can sometimes be seen as an anomaly. There are so many people who don't have the benefit of some of the privileges that you were able to have because your parents were successful and were able to send you to various places to get your educations. I know your mother fought hard for every bit of education she got, and she was sent away at a young age to live with her grandmother in a village, having come from a life of privilege with her. I think her father was a successful businessman and construction, I think you'd said he was in, and that they wanted to make sure that she had that root in the village, to sort of make sure she wasn't from a privileged background. She knew where her family came from. Do you think that had some roots in why she was so driven by community, is that she spent the time in the village, carrying her own water and going and collecting wood for her grandmother's fire and cleaning up and walking to school and all of those things? Do you think that made her more so, and her parents created the Dora that we know?
Huge. I absolutely think so and know so from also her reflections. And it's interesting because in that time she could only see the difficulty, but it allowed her to connect to, I think, to not resonate to, she can empathize easily with people in difficulty, and that was a big part of her charm. I share somewhere in the book that she could relate with anybody. My mother could get along with the most, what's a president to someone, sweeping, taking out trash in the street, and the same level of just sort of empathy, not empathy, feels just could relate because she had been through so many versions of herself in life as herself in different positions of just service and just the sort of the village doesn't have a lot of frivolity or comfort, so it was tough in many ways, and she was with her grandmother who pushed her really hard. So I know that that personality that she had that allowed her to not feel like life was enough when she got, if you're, the selfish sort of I make my money and I'm good, realizing that it's just a bigger story because she lived that in the village, that and saw also within that how powerful it is when community supports each other, because that's a culture that she came from in the village where everybody's looking out and taking care of each other, looking out for her when she's wandering around, looking out for her grandmother when she needs support, needs help, and vice versa. So she lived that, and it shaped her and shaped the work that she did and how she showed up.
It seems so evident when I was reading it, saying, okay, this is where she gets the roots from. Her roots in her family are so deep. And I know I always like an origin story. And so it wasn't just maybe what your father thought you were going to write about. It's like your mother and her accomplishments. It was what made her the person that she was. And that origin story is fascinating to me. I'm very interested in my own family history. I serve as the local history and genealogy librarian here at the library. So I'm always tracing my own family history. And to hear you talk about the earlier generations and the challenges they went through, that really resonates with me and my own personal interest. But it struck me that when you were writing about your family, that there's so many more stories there, and that you had to sort of keep it to a minimum to keep the story flowing about Dora herself.
Absolutely. There was a version editing process where I had a huge passage on my grandfather, PY, and I learned so much about him in research. And the editor's like, it's about Dora, so I had to rein that in because I was so excited to discover all of this about him. And within, he was someone who shaped her a lot as well. And his whole philosophy was on not being content with your own riches, because he became a rich man, but he was a poor man before that, and became a poor man again after the war. And he was able to find his sort of like joy in family, in community, and not just in wealth. So that was a huge part of what gave my mom sort of that. Money was not her driver, and that came from having had a father who had lost, gained and lost it all, and seeing how, that was, it was something that was not the story of a man. His story was bigger than that. And when he did have all that money, he was able to support so many. So to your point on her origin story and their origin story of those, you start seeing how there's an interconnectedness. And that goes back to how the title almost found itself, because that's the essence of so much of the book and her stories, that she is because they were, and so it goes. And they were because his father, my grandfather, found out that his father before him was this famous warrior that the people in the village knew, and and he was just someone that was just had a presence. And then you start seeing where maybe my mother got that from, and her, so it's where there's the interconnectedness. And maybe another thing I want to share is that it was so important for me that in telling her story, people don't distance themselves. Sort of like, oh yeah, but she's great and she's Dora. I could never be that. I think in sharing an origin story, we get to see ourselves even more so in these people that we admire so much, because we see not only what shaped them, but perhaps parts of us, how their fears, because when we're younger, it's easier for you to see and know our humanity, because she's just a little girl, and how she had fears and sorrows and disappointments. And perhaps in witnessing her in a fullness of herself, we can move away from that separation of sort of like, yes, but that's never going to be me, to, oh, that could be me. I see myself, and perhaps that could inspire people to find, some of my father would say, the Dora in them, like, where's the Dora in you? So, yes.
We actually have a question that's come in from one of the attendees, just saying that's so pleased to be here. And she says, your soul shines through. And I was wondering, she says, how you supported space for reflection with all the interviewing and gathering information that was deeply personal. I would think that great introspection and reflection was needed. Are there any processes or techniques that allowed time for this?
Thank you, Marcy. Absolutely. So when I wanted to start writing, I remember I sat on my computer, blank Word, I think it was Pages I was using, actually, blank. And I'm like, okay, we're going to start the book, and nothing. And it was just sort of strange for me, because I wanted there to be like flow. And then I realized that all these years writing, I'd never written anything personal on my computer. The kind of book I wanted to write, I'd never written. I write that in my journal. So I had this thought, like, why would I change my whole process and start on my computer? So I remember closing my laptop, picking up one of my journals, and I started writing the book in there. And what was the beginning, right? Over time, things change and drop and add. But that was how I birthed it, was in my journal. And anytime I started struggling, something just was stuck, I would, because of course, ultimately at the end of the day, you put it on computer, the flow can continue. But when I would be stuck, I would go back to my journal, wake up, and I will start writing. So different techniques. One is I went to bed dreaming this book. I dreamt this book. I woke up with this book. I journaled. I lived with it, with this story. I would be eating and chatting, but my mind is not there. I'm like, so I do a lot of writing in my mind. And I know when I connect to something, I kind of start writing it, the first line. And usually if I have a first line, I can like have the rest of the section. So that's one. But at the core, my greatest gift for myself that has helped me and helps whatever it is that you're connecting with has been my journaling every day for 10 years now, maybe more. And I got that from Morning Pages via Julie Cameron, via Artist Way. And it's something that's just been a huge part of my unleashing of my artist, of my writer. And I think because it helped me connect to my voice, right? That's what journaling that way, it's called flow of consciousness. So it's not so much sort of like capturing what happened the day before journaling, but just allowing what is to emerge. And it allowed me to connect with my voice. So I have a deep respect for my voice and a deep respect for how there's an endless stream within ourselves, because I've been writing for 10 years and there's never really a moment you go, there's nothing more to write. So there's just so much within. And once in connecting to this, I think I'm connecting to this flow for myself in my personal practice, and also different practices I have by extension of stillness. And I love nature. And if you know me, that's sort of my whole philosophy is find stillness, be in stillness. And writing is one medium, but there's so many mediums. Then I could sort of channel a little bit more clearly.
Well, it comes across that you've, reflected so much, and you talk about a personal story, as Marcy mentioned, and we're so happy that you were sharing this story with us today. I know that the book is just being released. I think it's been published this month. It's coming out in Nigeria tomorrow, I think I read. So like that will be is there a book tour in your future? Virtually, of course. Yeah, things lined up already. I think there's another question that's come in as well. This is from Jennifer. She says, I'm curious about the wealth of languages that you speak. Did you pick these up through world travel or study?
So my language story, very quickly. In secondary school, I had a teacher come in. So I went through secondary school sort of in the shadow of my three sisters who were superstars, and everybody was like, I hope you're like your sister. And I always been like, I don't think I am, but okay, I'm fine. And then I had a new teacher come in, a French teacher from King's College. I went to Queen's College with my sisters, and she had taught my brother. So she came and she said, oh, I hope you're like your brother. I thought, oh my goodness, are you serious? So first day of class, we're all meant to be quiet. I whispered to someone, and then she like hit me across the face. And she didn't know that in my school, it wasn't allowed to hit the kids. And in King's College, I suppose it was, but Queen's College had a pretty strict rule. And Nigeria is not uncommon. In primary school, teachers flog everybody. So it's not uncommon. So I was really upset because I just whispered something, and I just decided not to pay attention to French. And she would be sort of tell me how I wasn't good and I was a failure, and I got Fs all through French. And I'm not sort of your typical F student. It doesn't mean that there is one, but I was just sort of like I always pushed myself, but French F. So I took on this story of I'm not good at languages, I'm just zero. And luckily, I had an intervention. My sister had this idea before I went into undergrad that I go live for 2 months in Vichy, because I had a gap and I had space, and I thought, you're going to sponsor it? Of course. And that allowed me to access something that I would have gone my whole life believing that I wasn't good, because of that story that she told me that I internalized as mine, that I wasn't good. So this is to say that I broke through that. And that really also like gave me the huge message on like, be careful what you believe you can do, and sort of question the origins of that and challenge yourself. So once I sort of said picking up French, and I ended up doing study abroad in France, and I ended up learning French relatively with relative ease compared to most people that I knew in that same sort of trajectory gave me courage to try other things. So German was worked and lived in Berlin for a year. Chinese lived in Beijing for 2 years. Italian, I lived for work. I worked in the China Africa space. So it goes, but I was always working or studying and enjoying this part of me that I not only had ignored, but had completely convinced was not there. And enjoying how language opens up the world and people, like you become best friends the moment you open your mouth and you speak Chinese to a Chinese person, or you speak German to a German out of Germany, maybe not so much in Germany, it's not that interesting, but and so it goes, and so it goes.
I think we'll have to end it there. I'm just so fascinated. I want to hear more. Do you have any other books in the works you're thinking of, or is this one baby took a long time, so you're taking a break to take care of your own baby?
Funny enough, I think I got an idea a few days ago, so I'm feeling that like excitement. So, but it might be an idea that sparks another idea is how I feel it is. But it's something is igniting, and I'm here always for what ignites.
Well, we'd love to hear from it. We'd love to read about it. As we mentioned, Chidiogo's book is published this month, and it's on order, I believe, at the Oshawa Library, but not yet available. I think it's coming in for the publisher. You can find it. She's told me when we were preparing for this that she's recorded an audiobook version, which will be coming out shortly as well. And we look forward to other books by her as well. So if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, please do. It's available at all major booksellers.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Debbie.